There are so many factors that impact the well-being of law enforcement officers, from wellness topics and developmental content to organizational expectations and social connections. Rippleworks solves that problem by providing anonymous check-ins, so each officer can get exactly what they need and want for prime performance, while agencies learn in real time how their people are doing through analytic dashboards. Take a look at Rippleworks today at www.rippleworks.com and schedule a demo. That's rippleworks.com. From interviews to jail calls, Ditto Transcripts delivers fast, confidential, and court-ready transcription for law enforcement agencies. Ditto is CJIS compliant and is already working with agencies all over the U.S., including the Washington State Patrol and the National Park Service Investigations Unit. Get started now at dittotranscripts.com. That's dittotranscripts.com. To hear details about all the applications of Ditto Transcripts and exactly why this is a key solution for your organization's workload issues, check out episode 232. The views and opinions expressed by the host and guests of this show do not represent their employing agency, department, or organization. All information should be regarded as anecdotal, contextual, and educational, and should not be misinterpreted as legal or medical advice. Welcome to Blue Grit Radio, the podcast that explores making better cops for a better community. I'm your host, Eric Tung. I've been an active police officer since 2007. We will dive into the aspects of police culture, health and wellness, leadership, and mindset. You'll hear from experts not only from policing, but all industries as they relate to being our best with purpose, passion, and positivity. Join me as we share stories, lessons, and advice so we can all be better for ourselves, our teams, our families, and our communities. All right, everyone, welcome back. Today I'm sitting down virtually with Jen Moss, retired LT. Jen, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Eric. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we got, for the listeners, it's been a couple of years I've been trying to get Jen on the show, but I think it speaks to your humility and really just like kind of plugging away, doing the things you're doing with Lexipol, Police One. And it is a very, I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable, but it's a humbling remark to say, like, I'm not sure what I would offer, but you offer so much in the voice, but also the work you're doing and your experience in policing. So that's a little bit the intro. We connected first through Lexipol Police One, like a seminar, right? A webinar on recruiting and cultural, kind of some of the obstacles we're facing culturally in the profession. I want to say that was a couple of years ago. So that was an extremely rewarding experience for me to be able to work with you as a facilitator, setting it all up. And then some greats like Jim Dudley and Johnny Reddick, who has been a very impactful mentor remotely for me. So, but thank you for that. And I appreciate kind of thinking back to where we first connected.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, I continue that work with Lexipol, and it's been amazing to get to work and meet great people like you that are doing amazing things and in your own right in their profession.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, and Chief Ken Valentine, I was almost didn't mention him, but he was stellar on there too. And I think I remember off recording saying, like, speaking to all of you either in the prep call or following, where I was just like, man, I'm just a humble sergeant over here at the time, like in recruiting, and just the compliments were they were so validating to the work I was trying to do. But it's my nod to say there's a lot of people that communicate with me or send some positive notes or even ask for some advice, but they're sergeants, they're trainers, they're people that are, I would say, like the next generation coming up that I see they're doing all like the critical on the ground work, whereas a lot of mine is, remotely and conceptual through this project. But it is to say, like, no, like, if you wonder if you're doing enough, you probably are, because you're thinking about it. And here we are talking about policing on Labor Day.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely, Eric. And you know, just to share my thoughts on all the work that you're doing, I see you as a next generation. I'm retired now, and I think for all the people that you are impacting, you're having such a positive impact and a positive influence on the next generation of law enforcement, and that is so important to continue to keep this profession moving forward.
Thank you so much, Jen. I'm curious, could we rewind back? And it's always helpful for people to hear like the why. Like, we have people that they're getting their applications ready. Then there's people that are mid-career that are deciding if they should promote and kind of evolving through their career. And I always think it's helpful to share like the why, because sometimes it's very cemented in us, and sometimes we lose track because the burnout and because cynicism and all these things. So what prompted that for you?
So, to be honest with you, Eric, is initially I didn't wanna sit behind a desk all day.
That's
That's not
fair.
the type of job that I wanted. I wanted something that was different, where I was doing something different every day. Um, I'm not gonna say that the idea of service was not one that played a role in that, but I think, there's a little bit of that's like the cookie cutter, answer for law enforcement, but there's certainly truth behind that. But yeah, for
Hmm.
me, I wanted to do something different. And every day in law enforcement is different.
Yeah.
And that was really intriguing for me.
I had a lot of the same. It's like Office Space was a really
Yes.
impactful movie. Like when I was, I want to say in high school, and then watching it again in college and being like, man, I don't want to be in a cube. And, my mom, bless her soul, working so hard in a cube to provide for us. But yeah, it just wasn't me. But I think that was a lot of it in addition to the calls of service that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Ironically, both of us promoted into, I don't know what your role as an LT was, but I really try to get away from the desk and get in the car, and it's not. I have an inspirational goal, and it's to do a lot more than I'm doing, which is like barely, through the week. So, shout out to my sergeants who run stuff amazingly. But yeah, it's just so administrative. I don't know if you found that in your agency.
I did find that. And what really that idea of service really transitioned to, uh, ultimately, yes, service to the community, but it was really service to the people that worked in my organization, that
Hmm.
worked for me, and making sure, right, that idea of servant leadership, that I served them, that I made sure that they had the tools and resources that they needed to continue to go out there and do the job and do the work that we did every day. So that sort of became my goal when I transitioned to, uh, the sort of behind the desk position that I didn't really want when I initially started my career.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Leadership is a popular topic on this show. So like what was it that did it for you? I mean, you mentioned some of how you on the role, which I would highly agree with. I think more people need to recognize that that is the role, like taking care of your people. But what was the thing that really shifted you maybe to go into sergeant role and then beyond?
Yeah, I think anyone in law enforcement who's been in for a couple years, who's had the opportunity to work for some really great leaders and some really not so great leaders, has been able to have takeaways from both of those. And sometimes you learn more from those that aren't great leaders
Mhm.
in learning what you want to do, the type of leader that you want to become. And let's be honest, and I know that you'll agree with me on this, being a leader does not mean having rank. It doesn't mean having stripes. It doesn't mean having bars or stars, on your uniform. Some of the most incredible leaders that I worked with were the rank of officer. And they were those really strong, informal leaders that there are probably a small handful of those across, my agency. And you could ask anyone retired, who were those informal leaders? And they're all going to say the same people. And so, I wanted to, my idea behind promoting was I really wanted to sort of increase my sphere of influence. And you grow that by promoting, and when you promote to a sergeant, you kind of get your first squad, and you start to be able to influence, the people that are working for you in your squad, going out and taking calls every day, and sort of, impart the ideas of how you want to see policing done in community service, and
Mhm.
making sure that your people are taken care of, and thinking outside the box, and how to do that. Um, you know, Wellness has grown, right, like exponentially, in the last 10, plus years. And so it wasn't at the forefront when I first, promoted. And so there were a lot of different ways that I tried to connect with my people. And when I first promoted, I was still young. I was still young on the department, and I had a very, very tenured squad. So, you know, as you can imagine, that, you know, was a challenge in and of itself.
Yeah.
And trying to, be this new supervisor who's supervising folks that have 20 plus years on and trying to be, an effective.
Yeah, that's such a dynamic. I want to say I had about 10 years on when I promoted to sergeant, and I still felt young. I think it's a factor. Like I looked really young at the time because I started so young, I started at 21. What was the tenure for you when you went to sergeant?
I was just shy of 10 years. So I was think I was right around 9 years when I
Hmm.
promoted. So pretty much the same, but like you, I started when I was 21, so still I was still young. And yeah, to have 20 plus, 20 plus year veterans that were now reporting to me was challenging. Not the entire squad, but most of them were.
Yeah, it's a thing, and I think that 10 years, 9 years, 8 years, like that's pretty solid base even for let's just say like the last couple decades. But now we're in this place where people are promoting with plenty shy of that. And I think it's pretty necessary for the gap in experience that we are facing with so much attrition that happened, in the last 5 years. And so I do encourage people, if they're curious, if they're ready and they're really pondering it, and people are nudging them like as peers and people are nudging them from above, like, it's probably time to think about it really critically and not let an, I'll say, arbitrary amount of years dictate whether you're ready or not, or whether you should wait, because you kind of speak to that. Like, yeah, there's 20-year vets kind of eyeballing you and being like, okay, what's she all about? What does she know? Right. I think that there's an archetype that will exist in almost every agency. Like I felt it. I'm coaching some sergeants currently on that kind of dynamic, and just that challenging of a new boss, especially someone with less time on. And so a couple things. I am encouraging those to not like hold on so dearly to this like 10 or 15 years, like they need that time to do the next thing. But then it's also just to say, if you do wait, quote unquote, arbitrarily, then we're really going to be stalled in law enforcement, and we're not going to have people take on the senior leadership positions that we're going to need as like LTs and command staff and that kind of thing.
I agree. And I think, as someone who's now retired, it's easy to look at some of those that are promoting to say, like, how could they have promoted already? They don't have a whole lot of experience, but there is this void that's been created. And I do think that there are a lot of experiences that the younger members of the agency are having or could expose themselves to that are going to give them some critical experiences that will be beneficial for them when they promote, including field training, FTO, right? As an FTO, you are supervising, you are training, you are teaching, you are mentoring, and those skills apply directly to
Hmm.
the role of a sergeant. If you are an instructor out at the academy and you're teaching basic recruits, on your off time or, once a month or, whatever it may be, that that's another opportunity to really gain those skills with how to deal with supervising and dealing with with new recruits. So those are just kind of a couple of things that younger tenured officers can do, especially if they're thinking about promoting, or maybe draw on those experiences if they really hadn't thought about it but now are starting to think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Like even the roles that you mentioned, right? Like if you're the field training officer, you have direction from a field training sergeant or your patrol sergeant, right? Like so you're adapting the mission in a way that is the right context for your student. And effective trainers know you can't, it's kind of like parenting. I have one kid, but I get this from parents of multiple kids, but you can't effectively address every individual the same way with a broad stroke, right? So it's recognizing the really nuanced way that you can toggle coaching and mentorship. And I really appreciate you pointing those things out, because that was like my favorite part of going to sergeant, was like recognizing it's not about me saying I know best. It's about trying to course correct and trying to build in some guardrails, because I've made mistakes and I've been blasted on the stand. I definitely learned a lot of lessons of ineffective communication, and not showing the true why as to why I was being so rigid about this thing or that thing. Whereas with more time and I think confidence, it was more natural to do that. I think there's a lot of me that tried to say like, well, I tried to be such a way because I was worried that people would challenge and question things, because I did have some of those archetypes, as you said. for a while, it was like every rotation I had at least one that was like almost like a movie character, and how they would buck back and be passive aggressive and kind of obstinate. It seemed like out of their way to do so. I don't know if you had this, but I recently shared this with a newer supervisor because they were experiencing a bit of that. For me, it was literally finding the right time to bring them away from the call and the crew. They basically hung up on me, and I drove out to their next call to back them. And then I was like, "Hey, do you have a moment to talk about that thing?" And pretty overtly saying, "Hey, I perceived this when you did that. I took that as really unprofessional and borderline insubordinate. Not trying to blast you, but I don't appreciate it, and I don't want it to happen again." And after that specific like face to face confrontation, like it was like a 180. Like it, and like there wasn't this kind of this pushback and this power struggle. It was more like it was just more natural. I don't know if you experienced anything like that, but that's a story I've shared before because I remember what it was like to be in your head and trying to figure out like the right words and the right timing to address something like that.
So to your point, Eric, I think that's a great story and a great, illustration of dealing with different subordinates, dealing with different, people under your supervision. And I don't know that I had that exact situation, but I will say that because you mentioned the importance of the why, and I think that's super critical. You know, we come from this paramilitary style profession, right? Law enforcement being very paramilitary and very much like you will do what I say, you will, and this is how you're going to do it. But law enforcement has evolved and it's not that way anymore, right? There are a lot of ways to skin a cat, so to speak, and none of those ways are wrong. And so explaining the why, I think especially in the newer generations really want to hear the why and want to understand what they're doing and where you're coming from. So I do think sharing that is important. I think too, you talk about recognizing differences in the people that work for you. And I think that is really, really critical because not everyone is the same. And everyone has different strengths and different weaknesses. And I think our role as a supervisor is to recognize what those are and to exploit the right ones, right? So we want to exploit somebody's strengths because not everybody is going to be good at doing DUIs. You might have one or two people in your squad that are great at DUIs,
Hmm.
and you should help them exploit that and maybe let that help direct their career path if that's something that they're passionate about. You might have someone else that is really great at investigations, and they might take a little bit longer on some of their investigations, but they do really, really great and thorough investigations, even though you might be going, okay, they've been on that call for a while. It's time to move on to the next call, right? So instead of seeing that as a negative, you want to see that as a positive. And how do you exploit that and help push them to grow and help them take the next step in their career path? I think I could have done better at that throughout my career. I think that's something that I saw later in my career. So I think, piece of advice to supervisors out there is really look for those strengths and, the weaknesses that your people have. Try to provide growth opportunities, for those because we all need to continue growing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that like as you described it really underlines a couple of the hats that supervisors really ought to wear. And it's not about being the subject matter expert all the time. Of course, you should have a level of competence to what you're supervising, but that can be adapted, right? You can learn like enough to be quote unquote dangerous. So you know what your people are doing. And then as you mentioned way earlier, which is like helping your people get the things they need, the resources, removing obstacles. Like that is kind of the brass tacks that anyone would want their bosses to kind of run interference in that way. But is to say that you should be the facilitator, right? You're in a lot of ways you're moderating. You might not have all the best advice to get your officer into a detective role if you haven't worked detectives. However, you can put them in communication with the right people. You can carve them out time. You can nudge them towards this training. You can greenlight different things and different ideas and ops and warrants. And so you can definitely be the solid advocate that they want, to help advance their career and their skills. And I like how you said it's such a positive way to spin the word exploitation, right? But it's like, how do you enhance and like elevate that? Because so often it's just people not thinking about what they can do. It's people thinking about what they can't.
Absolutely. You talk about helping somebody promote to a detective even though you weren't a detective, right? It's just like I haven't handled every single call out there. And it's not about knowing how to handle every single call out there, but it is knowing where to find your resources and who to call when you don't know, and who to ask when you don't know. And I think that's a really, really critical piece of being a supervisor and knowing that it's okay to say, I don't know,
Yeah, it's actually
but I know
great.
where to find out. I know who to call because, right, we're all in this together. I probably still have phone numbers in my phone that I used, 15 years ago, resources of people that I used to call.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's one of the cool things about being in the leadership chain is like you get the direction, you get the mission, and then you figure out how you can adapt it. And you run it down to your people, and maybe they have questions, or maybe they're like, "Ooh, doesn't that cause this ripple effect?" And so it becomes more of a discussion, right? And it becomes like problem solving as a group. And that's some of my kind of favorite types of exercises that they're not really exercises, they just happen. But it was as a sergeant where, a senior officer came to me and I'm like, that's a really good question. And then I'd yell over the cubicle for the other sergeant to come over, and then they'd be boggled, right? A sergeant with twice my time on was that has, you would think, seen every call under the sun, but then to say, man, I thought I saw every call under the sun. And this one is a really weird curveball, right? We call the commander. And then he's similarly like, yeah, good one. Okay, I like what you said with this. Let's go this direction because of this. Same thing happens as commander, where that's like one of the more interesting things. So you're not just this like this mid manager that's just kind of the relay of information. It's like, no, someone comes to you and you're kind of game planning together, where a lot of times it feels like a team, like a leadership, like a smaller leadership unit between me and my sergeants. And that's super rewarding. Like that's really engaging. It's challenging. It's fun. As I think one of the more fun things that this role can be, which is to take on the mentorship of these up and coming or established leaders just at the line level. When you don't know how a recruit's really doing until week 10, that's a problem. TrackWired's field training management software replaces old school paperwork with a clean, automated system. Streamlined reporting, knowledge comprehension, and crystal clear performance trends, all handled in one secure place. TrackWire gives you real time insight into their field training process so supervisors get real time visibility. FTOs save hours and recruits stay on track. If you want to tighten up your FTO program, start by going to trackwire.com. That's TRACwire.com.
Absolutely. And it also, when you have those successes too, it becomes a team success, right? It's not a success of one singular person. It's a team success. And that's how you build relationships. That's how you build camaraderie. And all of those things are so important to being successful in this profession.
Yeah. You mentioned wellness earlier, and I think if I remember right, you're kind of connecting it to like how do you connect with your people? How do you take care of them? And I remember a conversation with a boss at a time ago where it threw these kind of philosophical organizational questions and sometimes philosophical policing questions where in conversations where he kind of said, I think that your customer base is your officer and my customer base is the public. And he didn't say it as a challenge, but more like an observation. And I paused and I was like, that's interesting. I was like, I don't disagree. And I am thinking about the public downstream, but in my desk, I don't frequently interact with the public, right? But my officers are interacting with the public like every single day, like dozens of times a day. And so I do think by virtue of taking care of my officers a certain way and my sergeants a certain way, then that trickles down into the type of culture of like, that is me taking care of you, and I know you are out there taking care of them. So it was an interesting kind of philosophical point that I think helped him realize like why I'm so focused on how officers feel, how they receive messaging, how they feel about this decision having these downstream effects that I didn't anticipate or we didn't anticipate. Um, I'm curious like what that kind of stirs up in you from your time like an LT, especially when you talk about wellness and some of these mechanisms that really weren't that fleshed out some time ago.
Yeah. So I mean, I totally agree with you, Eric, that yes, right? Like we take care of our people and our people in turn take care of the community, which are right, our customer base as a law enforcement agency. And so, but I think within law enforcement and within our organization, sometimes there's so much rigidity that it can be challenging to think outside the box. But as a supervisor, as a lieutenant, you do have some flexibility. I'll share an example. This is actually from when I was a sergeant. I had an officer who I started noticing some performance issues, like lack of reports getting done on time, not willing to take calls within their area of responsibility,
Mm.
just things like that were really kind of simple. And you would think, like, have a conversation and address them. But I took a slightly different approach. And I ended up meeting with the officer and asking them, like, is everything okay? Is there something going on? Because this is not how you normally perform. And I've noticed these sort of performance issues. And it came out that they were having some personal issues. They were going through a divorce and trying to sell their house. And so it made it really challenging to be out in the field and taking calls. So we were able to work something out where they stayed at the station and they handled any walk-ins that came in, which provided them some flexibility to handle some things that they needed to handle while they were at the station. It afforded them an opportunity to sort of take a deep breath because they weren't out in the patrol car, responding to calls, especially, priority type calls. The ones that come into the station are a little less, stressful.
Mhm.
So we were able to work that out in a way that had a minimal impact on the field, because then the person that was previously at the desk, because we had to rotate people in and out of the field to do that, then those people were able to stay out in the field.
Yeah.
So it became a win-win, but it was, at the time it was thinking outside the box. Now, like, you're like, yeah, no big deal. But at the time, that was not something that would normally have been done. It just afforded them an opportunity to sort of take a deep breath.
Yeah, absolutely. And I could see how a lot of agencies won't have the nimbleness to do that, but it probably doesn't take that much, right, to make an adjustment and have everyone kind of help the team in a different way. Like the work needs to be done. And I think that other people might hear that and it's like, okay, well, if you talk to the officer and they're not into it, then it's not a good fit, right? But ultimately, what I really like was kind of the beginning of you saying, like, you saw performance issues and you asked, hey, is everything okay? And I know that there's this kind of callous, like, impression or, stigma of like command staff, like coming in and just blasting people. But I can also see the perspective of this, which is, man, I don't want to pry and I don't want to be nosy. I see performance in a professional setting, so I will address the performance in a professional setting, and I'll be here. If they want to talk about it, they can talk about it. However, we all know that it becomes a version where it appears that we're not reserving judgment. It appears that we're just, just writing people up without trying to figure out why. And so I like how you put on like the curiosity cap, which is like, hey, like there might be something. I'll just ask, like, hey, is everything okay? It's whether they want to talk to you or not. That's up to them. But then it is kind of highlighting this culture of support and this culture of peer support and wellness. A couple of the conversations that were the most frustrating for me as an officer, I can remember the exact sergeants that did it at way different times in my career, was telling me that there was something that they needed to address and then interrupting me and say, hey, like, no, you don't need to explain yourself. I totally get it. It's fine. It's fine. I just need to tell you. But I was like, in one case, I was like, I literally didn't do that. But I was like, I'm going to bite my tongue so it doesn't seem like I'm arguing for the sake of arguing. And the other time was a total misunderstanding where later a lot of other people involved were like, that's not what happened. But I could see it, right? So both times I was like, no, 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 dude, you're fine. You're not in trouble, but just don't do it again. And meanwhile, I'm just like burning up inside. I'm like, I didn't do that or anything really. So, I mean, all to say, long-winded way to say, like, yeah, like, try to reserve judgment and be patient and ask, like, right? Like, just demonstrate that care as you so clearly explained.
Yeah. I think the other thing too is it can be really easy to have an issue, and instead of addressing one individual or a few individuals that are maybe engaging in that behavior, that you sort of do a blanket statement to
Yeah,
everybody,
those are the
uh,
worst.
right? And so what could end up happening as the people that are doing things the way that they're supposed to be start to sort of get down on themselves, in that they're like, well, I'm not doing that. I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. So sort of why am I getting the talk? Um, and I think one thing that can be really challenging, really for anybody, but supervisors specifically, and this includes our first line supervisors, sergeants, and commanders, is to the ability to have difficult conversations with people. And I think doing a blanket conversation with your entire squad is a little bit of a cop out, because you don't want to have a difficult conversation with one or two or three individuals to address the issue head on. So you have to be willing to have difficult conversations, right? That whole idea of being uncomfortable, or be
Hmm.
comfortable being uncomfortable.
No, absolutely. And I think that is every blanket emails are so many people's pet peeves. And like you said, officers get frustrated. I've seen them get resentful and even call out publicly, like, why am I getting another email for something like, I am very clear on the policy, right? I'm not throwing flammable things in the discard bin and evidence, right? Like that kind of thing. Whereas like sometimes it needs to be addressed and you don't know who's doing it. That's kind of the point. Like it needs
Sure.
to stop.
Yeah.
Let's just, please, everyone, let's be adults. But in the times that I can, like it's now trying to figure out, okay, can we actually identify who's doing this to save the blanket email? It doesn't have to be like we blast them, but like they need to know, because some people might not actually know, right? They might read that blanket email and be like, cool, that doesn't apply to me. They just scanned it. They didn't realize that they're off on the policy or the procedure or causing work for someone else. So I think that is like beyond like the discomfort. It's just like letting people know clearly, like they are the person doing it. So I'll just say, yes, I'm such a fan of that. One thing I did want to talk to you too about is like this article that you put out some time ago, but it speaks to a lot of the dynamics from your perspective and experience of women in policing. And it even talked about how, I believe there's a section where it was about how women are not necessarily advocates for other women. Can you talk a little bit about like what prompted that article? Because I've actually shared it out after I read it to many people that I work with or people that in neighboring agencies that brought up some of these similar themes that they've observed and they're trying to navigate through. And I was like, oh man, I remember seeing this article. And I think I actually hit you up about it because I couldn't find it immediately. And so I asked you to send it to me again. But it's on Police One. So yeah, can you please talk about that a little bit, Jen?
When we first, started today, you kind of shared that I now work for Lexipol, and my why, right, has transitioned me into this role where I now get to serve public safety through my role at Lexipol, and I've had the opportunity to write, a couple articles, and including this one on my experiences as a woman in law enforcement. And I think there are a lot of things that I tried to address in the article, but we know that women still account for a very small percentage of the members of the law enforcement community. 30 by 30 is out there trying to get us to 30% um, of sworn officers by 2030. So I think it's a great initiative, but there's a lot of, I think, internal cultural aspects that I think every agency, needs to look at. And I've had both positive and negative experiences, as a woman in law enforcement. And I think that at times we can really be our own worst enemies. um, we don't always support each other, because oftentimes we are competing for the same role, right? If you are in an agency where you're promoting or you're applying for a special assignment, and depending on the size of agency, like they might not they might only be looking for one one person, or one, I might consider one female to fill, to fill that role. And so you end up competing with other women. And so, that can sort of create this negative atmosphere where instead of supporting each other, um, we end up doing the opposite.
Hmm.
And I'll go back to the comment that I made earlier about promoting people's strengths and not their weaknesses, right? So I think, we all know those officers on the agency. We're like, oh, well, they're not a very strong patrol officer, right? Like they're not that great. They're not someone that I would regularly want to go on calls with. Well, we have the same opinions, whether they're male or female, but we all, I'm sure, know like those female officers that were like, oh, we're not interested in working with them, or they have this reputation or that reputation. And sometimes I feel like women's reputations, we don't have the same. It's not fair, right? With women and men, because sometimes men may do the same thing, but their reputation is not, it doesn't precede them like it does for some of us women. So, I think it's really important that we find a way to support each other, and again, to exploit our strengths. And there is room for all of us to be successful in the organization. It just depends on what that role is, and maybe it might be the other person that's selected for the role this time. But when you create that environment of support, then they can bring you up the next time, right? Or
Yeah.
be an advocate for you the next time.
Yeah. No, I think that you hit on a lot of prongs there that are helpful for people to think about, whether you're female, whether you're male, like to hear like some of the insights and some of the dynamics at play, right? Whether someone perceives, a fellow as like a threat, or whether I mean, not to go like too deep down like a Jungian psychology thing, which is like if there's something that you see in someone else and you're worried about exposing like your own insecurities about that thing. An example is that I think will make sense in this context is like I can't speak to that, but I can speak to like being Asian American and not having a ton of Asian American men and women in law enforcement. And so there was a point where I saw like a new hire email, and I'm like, I see the email and I recognize in reflection like my own bias, because when I see like an Asian male, like a new hire, I'm like, man, I hope they're awesome so that they don't like make me kind of look bad. And so that's a dynamic I know can be accurate for some people, because it was extremely embarrassing when we hired a guy that the stories came around that when he was in the academy, everyone had to snap to and like change real quick between DT stuff and like their normal uniform. But he put his gun belt on upside down, like in like kind of his inspection. And so he didn't make it through field training, but like that was probably just a symptom or a little anecdote as to why. But yeah, that like no one like called out because he was Asian, but I did assert, or I did associate that. I was like, well, that sucks. That sucks for Asian American new officers. But I recognize that, and I've shared this before, where when my agency went on to be a part of 30 by 30, some of our loudest internal critics were women. They're female officers, and and I get this from the similar perspective of like they worry that we are pushing a number and a stat and what that might mean because of context and because of history or what they see in the headlines, which is lowering of standards, right? And so when they do see, and they did see some new female recruits getting hired, there was apprehension, which I get. Like we are biased, and like some of that is like that we get conditioned to have kind of this prejudgment in the job, especially. But it is to say like, hey, like please try to wait, like see what they can do, and or hopefully like coach them up. Like you want them to be successful, to reflect positively, like let's coach them up and help them be successful. And I'm not at all trying to, hopefully the audience hears like I'm not trying to project what every individual's thinking, but that was a dynamic that was shared with me, and I can see from the perspective of again, a demographic that I do share, which is Asian Americans.
No, absolutely, Eric. I think you're spot on there. I totally agree.
Yeah, I hope that people, when they hear that, yeah, that is a ambitious number, but sometimes like we need really inspirational, ambitious goals to get somewhere, meaningful. Yeah, when the national average is like what, 12, 14%, somewhere around there. I think I've seen actually both stats. So, but to get to 30, and now we're closing, we're getting pretty close, like just a few years away. Hopefully the intention is to look at your practices. Are you handling engagement and your efforts to set yourself up for success, not like, oh man, whatever it takes. We only got we're closing in on, around 4 years or less. We just need to hire to make it happen. Like, hopefully that's not the thing of any real goal, right? Whether it's crime reduction or what have you.
No, I hope not to. And I think, there are a lot of different things that, that I'm seeing, and something else that I address in the article too is looking at those barriers to women entering the law enforcement profession to begin with, right?
Yeah.
You know, women are childbearing, and I think a lot of women question, can I be in law enforcement and also have a family? Because it's hard. I have 3 boys, and I was working patrol when I had my first. It is not easy. It's very challenging. And I think women in general tend to be the person in the household responsible for the taking care of children, making sure that the household, functions, and that can create an element of stress and create an internal barrier to go, well, like I can't do both. Or like, yeah, but then I need to work days because who else is going to pick my kid up from school
Hmm.
or from daycare? Um, and then it even complicates the matter more when your spouse or your partner is also in law enforcement, which, the father of my children was also in law enforcement. So, it just adds a whole, other element that agencies need to think about. There are a lot that's happening with childcare, um, and a lot of agencies looking at, alternatives for childcare.
Hmm.
Um, but it shouldn't be taboo to um, take a look at what the needs are and figure out ways to try and address those and help those to reduce those barriers.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I think that is accurate, right? Like statistically, as far as like where the responsibilities lie and societally, but as well as like what you see. And I was thinking like San Diego, and it's a large city, the good size agency, but having childcare centers, I believe I've seen those headlines. And so it is to say that maybe there are, just like smaller agencies co-op for resources or investigative teams or SWAT teams, like maybe like in a region you can have that kind of thing. I know again it might be kind of lofty, but what mechanisms do you have? And it also could be different types of schedules. And of course, there's a ton of obstacles, right? There's labor agreements and the contract and this and that. But if you have a staffing crisis and you need to get more people serviceable on the street, and some people just can't do it on 12s because who can, unless you have someone like that is that role. Maybe you do have some flexible schedules. Maybe you do have some options to work 5/8s in patrol, which I think most people I know would never sign up for that. But maybe that would be the game changer of like, I can start a family and actually stay a cop. Then great. Like, that's a win-win for people. So I do like how, I think that's a theme you brought up several times, which is to say, like, be flexible, be adaptable, like be creative in how we apply some of these things because it doesn't have to be this completely like crazy idea. I mean, just working different hours or having someone on desk duty so they can get their life right and get their head right. Like that's not like a this crazy unconventional idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Jen. Going into retirement, are there any reflections you have on policing and what you think police officers and leaders could benefit from remembering and focusing in on now that you're a bit out but alongside for for several years now?
I think really I'm going to go back to the concept that we talked about early on, and really kind of throughout our conversation today, and that is the importance of taking care of your people. Um, and taking care of your people does not necessarily have to mean, um, putting them before anything else, or right, like, but you do need to take care of your people, because if you are genuine in taking care of them and doing the right things by them to make sure that they have what they need and resources, we'll say wellness resources too, but they've got the resources that they need to do their job, and be that good advocate for them, serving them as your customer, then they're going to go out and they're going to do the same thing for the agency's customers, which is the community.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and I think, as I reflect back both on my career and maybe what I would like to see other leaders do more of, it's really it's that.
I love it. Thanks so much, Jen. Really appreciate your time and coming on.
Well, thanks, Eric, for having me. I really do appreciate it. This has been great.
Thank you for tuning into another episode of Blue Grit Radio. As always, support this community by subscribing, giving us a 5-star review, and following, liking, and sharing posts on Blue Grit Wellness on Instagram. You can reach me there or email me at bluegritwellness@gmail.com. Be well and stay gritty.